The rifle barrel pressed against my temple felt colder than a January morning. But it was the screaming from inside my cabin that made my blood turn to ice. 3 days ago, I thought I was buying a dying boy for $5. Now, 6 armed men surrounded my porch, and the boy was giving birth to what might be the most dangerous child in the New Mexico territory. You hear that, old man? The leader's voice cut through the dawn air like a rusty blade. That ain't no dying boy you got in there. That's our property, and she's got something that belongs to our boss. His finger twitched on the trigger. Something worth a lot more than $5. The screaming stopped. Complete silence filled the space between heartbeats. Then came the sound that changed everything. A baby's first cry, high and desperate against the morning wind. My hands shook as I gripped my Winchester, knowing I was outgunned 6-1, knowing that whatever was happening in my cabin was bigger than a simple mistake at a slave auction. Listen careful, Jake McKinnon. How did he know my name? You got yourself mixed up in something that's gonna get you killed if you don't hand over what's ours. That girl in there, she's carrying blood that kings would die for. And we aim to collect. The baby cried again, stronger now. Through my cabin window, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow against the lamplight. The girl I'd bought as a dying boy was alive, alert, and holding something in her arms that these men would kill for. The strange marks I'd seen on her wrists when I'd carried her from the auction block suddenly made sense. They weren't scars from sickness or hard work. They were something else entirely. You got 1 minute to decide, McKinnon. The leader's eyes were black as midnight. Hand her over peaceful, or we take her over your dead body. Either way, she's coming with us. But this story begins 3 days earlier, when I made the worst mistake of my life at the Albuquerque slave market. I'd ridden into town with $20 in my pocket and a desperate need for help on my failing ranch. The drought had killed most of my cattle, and at 62 years old, I couldn't work the land alone anymore. The auction block was my last resort. Buy someone young and strong enough to help me save what little I had left. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as the auctioneer dragged out his human merchandise. Men, women, children, all chained together like animals. My stomach turned, but I needed help more than I needed a clean conscience. Then they brought out the boy. He couldn't have been more than 17, thin as a rail fence, barely conscious. His clothes were torn and dirty, but underneath the grime, I caught sight of something that made me look twice. His hands were soft, too soft for field work. And those marks on his wrists, strange symbols that looked almost like brands, but not the kind you put on cattle. What's wrong with him? I called out to the auctioneer. Fever took him hard. Probably won't last the week. The man spat tobacco juice into the dust. Starting bid is $10, but I'll take $5 just to get him off my hands. Nobody else was bidding. The boy was dying, anyone could see that. But something about those marks, something about the way he held himself even in sickness, made me reach for my money. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was stupidity. Maybe it was the way his eyes opened for just a second and looked straight at me with an intelligence that didn't belong to a dying slave. $5, I heard myself say. Sold to the old rancher. I carried him to my wagon like a sack of grain, his body burning with fever against my arms. The whole ride back to my ranch, he mumbled in his sleep, words that sounded like Spanish, but with an accent I couldn't place. Rich Spanish, educated Spanish, the kind spoken in palaces, not slave quarters. By the time we reached my cabin, his fever had broken. I laid him on my spare bed and went to get water and food. When I came back, he was awake. staring at me with eyes that held secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Where am I? The voice was soft, musical. Definitely not what I'd expected from a dying slave boy. My ranch, about 20 miles south of Albuquerque. You're safe for now. He tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillow. You bought me. For $5. Seemed like you needed help more than they needed another dead slave on their hands. Something flickered across his face then, an expression I couldn't read. Fear? Relief? Determination? What's your name, senor? Jake McKinnon. And you? A long pause. Too long. Carlos. But the way he said it, like he was trying on a coat that didn't fit, told me Carlos wasn't his real name. Just like everything else about this dying boy was turning out to be a lie. The first sign that Carlos wasn't who he claimed to be came that evening when I brought him soup. His fever was gone, but he was still weak, still pretending to be sicker than he actually was. I watched him eat, noticed how he held the spoon, the way he sat up straight despite his supposed illness. Everything about him screamed nobility. From his perfect posture to the way he dabbed his lips with the corner of my rough blanket like it was silk. You're not from around here, I said, settling into the chair beside the bed. No, Senor McKinnon, I am from far away. How far? Mexico? Spain? His hand froze halfway to his mouth. In that moment of silence, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. Horses approaching in the distance. Not the casual ride of a neighbor or traveling merchant. These horses were moving fast, with purpose. Carlos heard them too. The color drained from his face, and his eyes darted to the window. How many? You tell me. They coming for you? He set down the spoon with shaking hands. Senor McKinnon, I need to tell you something. My name is not Carlos, and I am not a boy. Before I could ask what he meant, the rider's voice cut through the evening air. Jake McKinnon, we know you got something that belongs to us. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window. 3 men sat on horseback just beyond my fence line, silhouetted against the sunset. They wore the kind of clothes that cost more than most men made in a year. Fine leather, silver buckles, weapons that gleamed even in the fading light. What do you want? I called back. The merchandise you bought at auction. We'll pay you 10 times what you paid, plus compensation for your trouble. $50 was more money than I'd seen in months. But something about their tone, the way they sat their horses like they owned the world, made my teeth clench. The boy's sick. He's not going anywhere. Boy! One of them laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Is that what you think you bought? I looked back at Carlos, who was now sitting up fully, no longer bothering to act weak. What aren't you telling me? My name is Isabella Maria Esperanza de Castilla y León. The voice that came from Carlos's throat was definitely female, soft but strong. And those men out there want to take me back to a fate worse than death. The world tilted sideways. Isabella, a woman, Spanish nobility, judging by the string of names, and I'd been fool enough to buy her at a slave auction disguised as a dying boy. The binding around your chest, I said, pieces falling into place. The soft hands, the way you eat. She nodded. I have been running for 3 months, senor. Those men work for Don Rafael Mendoza, the man my family promised me to in marriage. A marriage that would unite our lands, but destroy any chance I have at choosing my own life. The riders were getting impatient. McKinnon! Don't make this harder than it needs to be. How did you end up at a slave auction? Bandits captured me 2 weeks ago while I was traveling with my disguise. They had no idea who I was, just saw an opportunity to make quick money. I let them think I was a dying boy because I knew no one would buy damaged goods. Her laugh was bitter, except for one kind old rancher who couldn't stand to see someone suffer. And now Don Raphael's men have tracked me here. They will take me back, force me into marriage, and use my bloodline to claim territories that don't belong to them. Outside, I heard the sound of more horses approaching. A lot more horses. This wasn't just 3 men anymore. Through the window, I counted at least a dozen riders spreading out around my property, surrounding us like wolves circling wounded prey. There's something else, Senor McKinnon. Isabella's voice dropped to a whisper. Something I have not told you. Something that makes this more complicated than just a runaway bride. What? She placed her hand on her stomach, and even through the loose clothing, I could see the slight curve she'd been hiding. I am carrying a child. The child of Prince Eduardo Alejandro de Castilla, the exiled heir to the Spanish throne in the New World. My blood turned cold. Royal blood. A child that could claim kingdoms. No wonder these men were willing to kill for her. The prince and I were to be married before the political winds changed, and he was forced to flee. Don Rafael discovered our secret and had Eduardo declared a traitor. Now he wants me and the child to legitimize his own claim to power. The sound of boots on my porch made us both freeze. They weren't waiting anymore. Isabella Maria de Castilla y León. The voice was different now, educated, commanding. I am Captain Diego Morales, representing Don Rafael Mendoza. You will come with us willingly, or we will take you by force. The choice is yours, but you will come. Isabella gripped my arm with surprising strength. Senor McKinnon, I know I have brought danger to your home. If you want to hand me over, I will understand. I looked into her eyes and saw something I recognized. The desperate hope of someone who'd been running for so long, they'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand with them instead of against them. How long until the baby comes? Any day now. The stress, the travel, the fear. I can feel it beginning. As if summoned by her words, she doubled over in pain, gasping. Her first contraction hit just as Captain Morales kicked open my door. The door exploded inward like thunder, and Captain Diego Morales stepped into my cabin with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. He was tall, elegant in the way that Spanish nobles carried themselves, with a thin mustache and eyes like polished steel. Behind him came 2 soldiers in uniform, their hands resting on their pistols. Senora Isabella, he said, sweeping off his hat in a mock bow. Don Rafael has been very worried about you. Isabella doubled over again, another contraction hitting her like a physical blow. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, but I could see the pain written across her face. I am not going anywhere with you, Diego. I'm afraid that decision is no longer yours to make. His eyes shifted to me, measuring, calculating. And you, Senor McKinnon, have interfered in matters far beyond your understanding. The only thing I understand is that a pregnant woman is about to give birth in my cabin, and you're not welcome here. I kept my rifle trained on him, though I knew it wouldn't do much good against a dozen armed men. Pregnant? Morales' eyebrows shot up. Then his expression changed to something hungry, predatory. Even better, Don Rafael will be pleased to know that Prince Eduardo's bastard will soon be in our custody as well. The child is legitimate, Isabella gasped between contractions. Eduardo and I were married in secret before he was exiled. a marriage performed by a priest who has since mysteriously disappeared. How convenient. Morales smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Without documentation, the child is nothing more than another bastard with pretensions. Another contraction hit Isabella, stronger this time. She cried out despite herself, and I could see fluid beginning to soak through her clothing. This baby was coming whether we were ready or not. She needs help, I said. Whatever political games you're playing can wait until after the child is born. On the contrary, this changes everything. Morales gestured to his soldiers. Take her to the wagon. Don Rafael will want to witness the birth himself, ensure the child bears the proper bloodline markers. What markers? I demanded. Isabella looked up at me with pain-filled eyes. All children of the Castilla line are born with distinctive birthmarks, sacred symbols that prove royal blood. If this child bears them, then Don Rafael can claim legitimacy through marriage and bloodline both. Morales finished. The child will be raised as his own heir, and Isabella will be his devoted wife. A perfect arrangement. Over my dead body. That can be arranged, old man. Thunder crashed overhead as a storm rolled in from the west. Through my windows, I could see lightning illuminating the faces of the men surrounding my cabin. They were professionals, soldiers, not bandits or hired guns. This was a military operation. Isabella screamed as another contraction hit, this one lasting nearly a minute. When it passed, she was breathing hard, sweat beading on her forehead. Jake, it's coming now. I can't wait much longer. You have a choice, Senor McKinnon. Morales' voice was reasonable, almost friendly. Help us deliver the child safely, and we'll pay you well for your assistance. Continue to resist, and we'll take both mother and child over your corpse. Either way, they're coming with us. I looked at Isabella, saw the fear and determination warring in her eyes. Then I made a decision that would probably get us all killed. Captain Morales, you ever deliver a baby? What? I asked if you've ever delivered a baby. Because if you want this child born alive, you're going to need someone who knows what they're doing. And it's not going to be easy with all that thunder and lightning spooking your horses. As if on cue, another crash of thunder made several of the horses outside whinny nervously. In the distance, I could hear some of his men calling out as their mounts shied away from the lightning. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if you want this royal heir born safely, you let me help deliver it here in my cabin, where it's warm and dry. Then we can discuss terms. Isabella caught on immediately. Yes, she gasped. Please, Diego. I've been traveling for months. I'm weak. The baby is coming early. If something goes wrong. Morales studied us both, suspicion clear on his face. But another lightning flash lit up the cabin, followed immediately by thunder that shook the walls. Outside, his men were having trouble controlling their horses in the storm. Very well. But my men stay close. And if you try anything foolish, McKinnon, I understand. Isabella cried out again, this contraction lasting even longer. When it ended, she looked at me with gratitude and something else. Trust. Jake, I need you to know something. If this child is born, if it bears the marks of the Castilla line, it will never know freedom. Don Rafael will use it as a tool to claim power, and it will grow up knowing only duty and political manipulation. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes the kindest thing a parent can do is protect their child from the life they were born into. Morales stepped closer, hand on his pistol. What is she talking about? Another contraction hit, stronger than all the others. Isabella gripped the bed frame so hard her knuckles turned white. "It's coming," she whispered. "The baby is coming now." Rain began hammering against the roof as lightning split the sky directly overhead. In that moment of brilliant illumination, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Isabella's eyes weren't focused on the pain anymore. They were focused on the knife I kept on my bedside table, calculating distance, opportunity. Whatever she was planning, it was going to happen in the next few minutes. The baby's first cry cut through the storm like a blade through silk. I held the tiny, wet form in my hands. And in that moment, everything changed. The child was perfect, healthy despite being born weeks early. But it was the birthmarks that made Captain Morales step forward with hungry eyes. On the baby's left shoulder, clear as ink on paper, was a mark shaped like a crown. On the right wrist, 3 interlocking circles that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. And across the small chest, barely visible but definitely there, were symbols that looked like ancient Spanish script. "Dios mío," Morales susurró. "The marks of Castilla. This child truly is of royal blood." Isabella was exhausted but alert, her eyes never leaving the baby in my arms. "Let me hold my child," she said softly. "Not yet." Morales gestured to one of his soldiers. "Take the infant. Don Rafael will want to examine the markings personally before we proceed." Like hell. I stepped back, still holding the baby. "This child stays with its mother until she's ready to travel." "The child goes where I say it goes, old man." That's when we heard the new sound, cutting through the rain. A single horse approaching at full gallop. Morales frowned and moved to the window. What he saw there made his face go pale. "Captain," one of his men called from outside. "Rider approaching under the Spanish flag." "Impossible," Morales muttered. But the hoofbeats were getting closer, and I could see the tension in his shoulders as he recognized something he didn't want to face. The rider burst into view just as lightning illuminated the yard. Even through the rain, I could see he was different from Morales and his soldiers. Taller, broader, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even at a distance. He dismounted in one fluid motion and strode toward my cabin like he owned the entire territory. "That's Prince Eduardo," Isabella breathed, struggling to sit up. "He found us." The door didn't just open this time. It seemed to part before the man who entered. Prince Eduardo Alejandro de Castilla was everything I'd expected Spanish royalty to be. Tall, dark-haired, with eyes that had seen both triumph and exile. He wore simple traveling clothes, but he carried himself like a king. "Captain Morales," he said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "You are trespassing." "Your Highness." Morales tried to maintain his composure, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "We are here on the authority of Don Rafael Mendoza, acting as regent in your absence. My absence was temporary. My exile has been lifted by royal decree from Madrid." Eduardo's eyes found Isabella on the bed, then shifted to me, holding the baby. "I see I arrived just in time." "The child bears the royal marks," Morales said quickly. "Don Rafael's claim of legitimacy through marriage and bloodline is still valid." "Is it?" Eduardo stepped closer to me, and I found myself looking into eyes that held both kindness and steel. "May I see my child, senor?" I looked at Isabella, who nodded weakly. Carefully, I placed the tiny bundle into Eduardo's arms. The change in his face was immediate and complete. This wasn't a prince looking at a political tool. This was a father seeing his child for the first time. perfect," he whispered. Then, louder, "Captain Morales, you and your men will leave my family in peace." "I'm afraid that's not possible, Your Highness. Don Rafael has invested considerable resources in this operation. He expects a return." "Then Don Rafael will be disappointed." The baby stirred in Eduardo's arms, making small sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the tense cabin. Outside, I could hear Eduardo's men taking positions around Morales' soldiers. The storm was intensifying, but the real tempest was building right here in my small cabin. "There is another consideration," Morales said carefully. "The marriage between you and Isabella was never properly documented. Without official recognition, was performed by Father Miguel Santos in the chapel at San Miguel del Vado 3 days before my exile." Eduardo's voice never rose, but somehow it filled the room. "I have the documentation, signed and sealed, in my saddlebags." Isabella struggled to sit up straighter. "Eduardo, how did you find us?" "I never stopped looking, mi amor. When I heard about the slave auction in Albuquerque, I knew it had to be you. Only you would be clever enough to disguise yourself as a dying boy." His eyes found mine. "And only a man of true honor would buy a stranger for $5 simply because they needed help." "This is very touching," Morales interrupted. "But Don Rafael's men outnumber yours 3-1. Even with documentation, possession is 9/10 of the law." "You're assuming I came alone?" As if summoned by his words, we heard the sound of many horses approaching through the storm. Not the scattered hoofbeats of men caught in the rain, but the organized rhythm of a cavalry unit moving in formation. Eduardo smiled for the first time since entering my cabin. "I brought friends." Through the window, we could see torches cutting through the darkness despite the rain. Dozens of them, surrounding my property in a perfect circle. Morales' confident expression crumbled as he realized he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. "You have a choice, Captain," Eduardo said, still holding his child with gentle hands. "Surrender now, and you and your men can ride away unharmed. Continue this foolishness, and face the consequences of threatening the heir to the Castilla line." Morales' hand moved toward his pistol, but he stopped when he saw Eduardo's men through every window. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and caught in a storm with nowhere to run. "This isn't over," Morales said finally. "Don Rafael will not forget this insult." "Neither will I," Eduardo replied. "And unlike Don Rafael, I have the crown of Spain behind me now." The baby chose that moment to cry again, a strong, healthy sound that seemed to cut through all the political posturing and remind everyone what this was really about. A family trying to stay together. But I could see in Morales' eyes that he wasn't finished. This was a man who had invested too much to walk away empty-handed. Whatever he was planning, it was going to happen soon. Dawn was breaking through the storm clouds when Captain Morales made his final play. I should have seen it coming. Should have recognized the look in his eyes when he'd agreed to surrender too easily. A man like Morales didn't build his reputation by walking away from fights he thought he could still win. "Very well, Your Highness," he had said, holstering his weapon with theatrical resignation. "We will withdraw, but I want to pay my respects to the child before we go. Surely even you would not deny a fellow Spanish nobleman that courtesy." Eduardo hesitated, but Isabella nodded from the bed. "It's traditional, mi amor. Let him see what he lost." That was the mistake that almost cost us everything. Morales approached slowly, hands visible, his expression one of defeated acceptance. Eduardo held the baby protectively, but allowed the captain to come within arm's reach. The child was sleeping peacefully, the royal birthmarks clearly visible in the lamplight. "Magnificent," Morales murmured, leaning closer. "The bloodline is unmistakable." Then, faster than a striking snake, his hand shot out. Not toward the baby, but toward Isabella. The small knife he'd palmed from his boot appeared at her throat before anyone could react. "Now we renegotiate," he said calmly. "The child for the mother. Choose quickly, Your Highness." Eduardo went rigid, the baby still cradled in his arms. Outside, his soldiers had seen the movement through the window, but they couldn't act without risking Isabella's life. "You coward," Eduardo growled, threatening a woman who just gave birth. "I'm being practical. Don Rafael needs the child, but he'll settle for the mother if necessary. She can always have more children." The knife pressed closer to Isabella's neck, drawing a thin line of blood. What's it going to be? Isabella's eyes met mine across the cabin, and I saw something there that chilled me more than the storm outside. She was making the same calculation I was. This would never end. Even if Eduardo gave up the baby, even if Morales rode away victorious, they would keep coming. Don Rafael would always want more, would always see this family as tools for his ambition. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the tense silence. "The rifle." My Winchester was leaning against the wall, 3 steps away, but might as well have been 3 miles. Morales was watching Eduardo and the baby, but his peripheral vision would catch any movement I made. "Choose now, Prince." My patience grows thin. That's when Eduardo did something I'll never forget as long as I live. Without warning, without hesitation, he handed me the baby. "Hold my child, Senor McKinnon, and remember that you were the first person to show kindness to this family when no one else would." "Eduardo, no," Isabella breathed. But the prince had already made his choice. In one fluid motion, he drew his sword and lunged forward. Not at Morales, but between him and Isabella, deliberately putting himself in harm's way to break the captain's hold on her. The knife meant for Isabella's throat caught Eduardo in the shoulder instead. He spun with the impact, but managed to drive his elbow into Morales' face, breaking the man's nose with a sound like snapping wood. Isabella rolled away from the bed as the 2 men crashed to the floor, and I found myself holding a royal air while a fight for kingdoms played out in front of my fireplace. Eduardo was wounded but younger and stronger. Morales was desperate but experienced with a knife. They rolled across my cabin floor, knocking over chairs and scattering my few possessions, each trying to gain the advantage. "The rifle, Jake," Isabella shouted. But I couldn't move. The baby in my arms was crying now, frightened by the violence, and every instinct I had told me to protect the child first. Eduardo and Morales would have to settle their own score. The fight ended suddenly when Eduardo managed to pin Morales' knife hand to the floor. For a moment, they were locked in a deadly embrace, muscles straining, both men breathing hard. "You cannot win this," Morales gasped. "Don Rafael has resources you can't imagine. He will never stop coming for what he believes is his." "Then he'll keep losing," Eduardo replied, and drove his fist into the captain's temple. Morales went limp. The sudden silence was deafening. Outside, I could hear Eduardo's soldiers calling out, but inside the cabin, there was only the sound of the baby's crying and Eduardo's labored breathing. "Is he dead?" Isabella asked. Eduardo checked for a pulse, then shook his head. "Unconscious. He'll live to face justice in Spain." "And Don Rafael?" "We'll learn that exile taught me many things, including that some fights are worth having, no matter the cost." Eduardo winced as he stood, blood seeping through his shirt from the knife wound. But his eyes were clear and determined as he took the baby from my arms. "Senor McKinnon, I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saved my family when you had every reason to walk away. I just did what seemed right. What seemed right was the bravest thing any of us have done." He looked down at his child, now sleeping peacefully again despite the chaos. "What will you do now? Your home has become a battlefield because of us." I looked around my cabin, at the overturned furniture and broken dishes, at the blood on my floor and the unconscious man who tried to destroy a family for political gain. Then I looked at Isabella, holding out her arms for her child, and Eduardo, wounded but victorious. And I realized something important. "I think my ranching days are over," I said. "But if a Spanish prince needs a trusted advisor in his new territories, I know an old man who's good with a rifle and doesn't ask too many questions." Eduardo smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "I think that can be arranged." Outside, the storm was passing, and the first rays of real sunlight were breaking through the clouds. As Eduardo's soldiers took Morales and his men into custody, I realized that sometimes the best investments aren't the ones you plan for. Sometimes they're the ones that cost you $5 and change your life forever. 6 months later, I stood on the porch of the finest ranch house in the New Mexico territory, watching Prince Eduardo teach his son how to hold a toy horse. The baby was walking now, laughing as he chased chickens around the yard under his father's careful supervision. The royal birthmarks were still there, but they no longer represented a target on his back. They represented hope for a new kind of kingdom, one built on choice rather than obligation. Isabella emerged from the house, no longer disguised as a dying boy, but radiant in the afternoon sunlight. "Jake, dinner is ready." Don Rafael had never come looking for them again. Word from Spain suggested he'd found himself facing charges of treason and kidnapping. Captain Morales had testified against him in exchange for leniency, and Eduardo's exile had been permanently lifted. As we sat down to eat together, 3 generations around one table, I thought about that $5 decision that had changed all our lives. I'd thought I was buying help for my failing ranch. Instead, I'd bought a family, a purpose, and a future I'd never imagined. Sometimes the best purchases are the ones that seem like mistakes at the time.